Hi, I'm Sean Shea, and I'd like to welcome you back to our second module in our Introduction to the Rogers Memorial Hospital Intake Specialist Interview course. And what we're doing is this time we're going to turn our attention to actually interviewing technique itself, get a little bit of a better idea of when you're using these techniques, why are you using the techniques, and how might you be able to utilize them even just a little bit better. Now, over the past 3 decades, as I said, I've been studying the interviewing process in all sorts of different situations with all sorts of different personnel, from non-professionals to professionals, from psychiatrists to counselors to case managers. We've learned quite a bit about interviewing itself and how it can be taught. One of the things that we've learned, if you take a look at our slide over here, is that there are interviewing principles, which are basic abstractions about when we use a particular type of interviewing technique and why we might use it. Interviewing principles are always sort of abstractions. So you might say that you want to roll with the concern of the person so that you don't antagonize them or oppose them. They're very useful for giving us ideas of what to do in an interview, but the problem with them are they're abstractions. And of course, they don't tell you exactly what to say. Well, one thing that's a beauty of what you're going to be doing is we're literally writing out, for the most part, what exactly we want to say, but we still want you to understand why they're written the way they are, which takes us to our second thing up here. Interviewing techniques. An interviewing technique is a specific set of words that forms either a statement or a question, and then it's tagged with a name. And interviewing techniques allow us to have tremendous flexibility if we're doing a free-form interview, but also even when you're using a scheduled interview like you are primarily utilizing, it's really nice to know why this question has been phrased the way it is so that you can use the question to its maximum. And then of course there's one thing we all know. No matter how scheduled interviews are, sometimes patients take off and things happen that we're not expecting. You're going to actually understand certain types of principles, which will allow us for you to think on your feet if you have to. In other words, we're going to give you some interviewing tools that I think are going to help you to feel more secure about what you're doing during the interview itself. Finally, if you take a couple interviews and you combine them 2 or more together, you have what we would call an interviewing strategy. In our next module, I'm going to be talking a little bit about an interviewing strategy called the chronological assessment of suicide events, which is a strategy that will allow you to uncover suicidal ideation, behavior, and planning and intent. But that's for next time. This time, we just want to focus on a small handful of interviewing techniques. If you recall, we talked about the name of the game is validity. We have to make sure that the information that you're communicating to the psychiatrist is accurate information. We've already demonstrated that a cornerstone of validity is actually the engagement process itself. To what degree does the person feel comfortable sharing? But you know, it's even a little bit more complicated than that. There are actual ways of phrasing questions that over time we've learned as interviewers can increase the likelihood that a patient is going to be more interested in actually sharing the truth with you. These are called validity techniques. Here's 7 of them. Normalization, shame attenuation, the behavioral incident, gentle assumption, denial of the specific, the catch-all question, and symptom amplification. Believe it or not, if you look at the interviewing literature, there's probably 20 to 30 of these validity techniques that have been developed in the past, say, 15 years roughly. We're only going to look at a couple of them. In fact, we actually use only a couple of these in the actual interview that you're going to be doing. And so I think you're going to have a fun time learning exactly how they were designed. The first thing we're going to look at is 2 of the validity techniques are designed to help you or any type of interviewer to raise a sensitive or taboo topic. The trick is, obviously, whether it's over a phone like we're doing or doing a face-to-face, if you have to raise something like incest or you have to raise something like suicide, how do you do that in a way that the patient feels comfortable sharing with you? Well, 2 validity techniques were developed to do just that. Normalization and shame attenuation, and we're going to take a look at both of these. Normalization was a technique that actually I developed back, the term was actually coined about 1998, and it's a technique that works on a following interviewing principle. If you're going to raise a sensitive topic, what you want to do is meta-communicate to the person over the phone or face-to-face that it's safe to share this information with them. So that's the interviewing principle we're working on. Now we can see how that interviewing principle can be put into a variety of different interviewing techniques. And one of them is, of course, called normalization. Watch how this thing might work. We're deep into the interview on the phone, and a patient, you're feeling concerned about suicidal potential and you want to raise suicide. That's obviously a very tricky thing to raise for some people. I'm going to meta-communicate that it's okay for you to talk about whatever suicidal thoughts you've had. I'm going to do that by indicating to you, you know what? I've heard this from other people. So it works very simply like this. Deep into the phone interview, at this point in time, we want to raise the topic of suicide. Simply turn to the person and say, you know, Mary, sometimes when people are as depressed as you've been, and boy, it sounds like you're dealing with a lot in your life, you know, they find themselves having thoughts of killing themselves. I'm wondering if you're having any thoughts like that. And boom, you've raised the topic of suicide in a way that helps the person to feel safe and comfortable to share it because you've told them, geez, I've heard this from a lot of other people. Now let's take a look at it one more time on our slide. Sometimes when people are as depressed as you've been feeling, they find themselves having thoughts of killing themselves. Have you been having any thoughts like that? Notice the most important thing to start it off is that it always begins with words like sometimes when people or sometimes people. In other words, in a normalization, you're helping the person to feel safe by sharing that you've talked to someone before who's had this. So actually, it's always starting by addressing the idea that you've heard it before. It's addressing something outside of the room itself. Now, in normalization, in your interview, this is all spelled out. This is literally what it'll look like, and you simply read it. So it's going to be very simple for you to do. But what we want you to do is we want you to know why it's being done. In other words, every time you use a normalization, you're reading this, you understand you're trying to meta-communicate to the person, it's okay to talk about this. It's okay to talk about the incest. It's okay to talk about the trauma that you had in Afghanistan. And the trick is your tone of voice and how you do that. And I think you're going to see that you get better and better at it because you understand why you're doing it. Now, that's one way to raise a topic when it's hard for a person to share it. Another way that you'll sometimes see in your interviews, and once again, this is all written out, you'll simply be reading it, but here's a different approach. The same principle. If I'm going to raise a taboo topic, I want to make sure that I meta-communicate to you it's okay to talk about this, but I'm going to do it in a different way. Watch. This one is called shame attenuation. The word attenuate means to put down, to decrease the intensity of something. So this is a technique that decreases any sense of shame that one of our clients might have over a phone about what they're going to share with us. This time, the interviewer doesn't say anything about somebody outside of the room. I'm going to meta-communicate that it's okay to talk to me about this because I'm going to meta-communicate to you. I get it. I get how bad your pain is. And that's what I meta-communicate. So watch. Once again, when I decide to raise the topic of suicide, I simply turn to the person. I say, you know, Mary, with all of your pain, have you been having any thoughts of killing yourself? It's a very simple technique, but boy, it meta-communicates. I get the pain. I understand where you're coming from. It wouldn't surprise me if you're having some thoughts of killing yourself. Now, once again, we're not asking you to learn how to use this technique in the sense that you're spontaneously using it. You'll always be prompted to use it. On your interview flow sheet, you'll literally see words like this and you'll simply read them off. Let's look at it again. With all of your pain, have you been having any thoughts of killing yourself? On the other hand, I do think it is very useful for you to understand where these techniques came from, what you're trying to accomplish with them. And once again, there's always the possibility that if things go off track in an interview and you don't know exactly where you want to go, you'll remember these techniques and they can help you to get back onto track. So, validity. Those are the techniques we're going to focus on. You're going to see them used over and over again on our intake interview that you'll be performing. Let's look at something else. This is something you've probably heard a lot about, open-endedness. You always hear about are questions open-ended or not open-ended. Actually, if you look at the literature, what you discover is it's much more complex than it appears at first glance, you know, whether a question is open-ended or not. We're going to look at just a couple of techniques. In fact, I'm going to share with you some things from something called the degree of open-endedness continuum. In the literature, it's just simply known as the DOC. The DOC is actually something that we developed. And we developed this beginning way back in the late 1980s and then have further made developments on over the years. The DOC is a way of looking at interviewing questions or statements that people make and helping us to understand how open-ended they are. The actual DOC has about 9 different interviewing techniques. By the way, any interviewing question or statement that any interviewer uses fits one of these 9 categories. So it's a pretty slick system. But what we want to focus on are a couple of the things from the doc that could help you in this interview. Occasionally, there are going to be times where, as a person's describing a symptom, you're going to be free in this interview process to explore it a little bit. You might say something like, tell me a little bit more about what it's like for you when you're awakened out of your sleep with frets. So you're going to learn how to use some open-ended techniques and empathic statements to help this interview feel very free-flowing and naturalistic to the client on the phone. So let's look at an open-ended question. Open-ended questions, they always begin with the word how or what, and they have a very broad sense of potential answers. In other words, a question could begin with the word how, be closed-ended. How many brothers and sisters do you have? 5. That's a closed-ended question that's beginning with the word how. So not all questions that begin with how or what are open-ended. They have to have a broad set of potential answers. In other words, you don't know exactly what the person's going to say. So let's watch these. Here's a couple of examples. What are some of the stresses you're coping with recently? How would you handle the divorce differently if you could do it again? Or what are some of the problems with your boss? Those are all nice examples of open-ended questions. You will see some of the open-ended questions utilized actually scheduled out for you. You're going to use these more in the very opening of the interview when you're trying to just get the person talking and feeling comfortable with you. I think you'll find they're very powerful techniques. By the way, we'll get a chance to practice these things along the road. The next thing is called a gentle command. Now, in the sort of lore of interviewing, people have always thought that open-ended questions were the most open of all the things that you could use. In other words, they were the most likely to produce a lot of speech from someone. Actually, a lot of interviewing experts, I happen to be one of them, I don't think that's quite true. Curiously, there's a statement that you can make to a person that I think is even more open-ended for them. In other words, it's something that you can say that it makes it even more likely that the person is going to share a lot of information about something. And these are called gentle commands. They always tend to begin with words like, tell me a little bit about, or tell me more about, or describe what happened back then. So here's some examples. Tell me something about your brother. Describe your initial reaction to me. Tell me what some of your hopes are about your marriage in the future. You'll notice that it's actually a very open-ended technique. It does have to have a very broad set to be a gentle command. For instance, if I said, tell me what grade you got in the last test, well, that's not a gentle command because it can be answered with a very simple answer or question. So it still has to have a broadness to it. But I think you're going to find that gentle commands surprisingly powerful at getting people to share stuff. It wouldn't be at all unusual in this interview if you asked, from your script, you might say to a person, and this is a nice example of it, sometimes people who are depressed, there's your normalization, by the way, they tell me that they're jolted out of their sleep by their worries or frets, and boy, they just cannot get back to sleep. Jim, is that anything that you're experiencing? So the client says to you, yeah, no, that happens to me all the time. At that point, that would be a very natural spot to say, tell me a little bit about what that's like for you. Beautiful open-ended technique. And the patient will share with you their real world. What do they fret about? What is it like? Do they stay in the bed? Do they get up? What this will give you is a real insight into if this is truly early morning awakening. That what is this person actually experiencing? We're going to see a little bit later in one of our future modules that early morning awakening, for instance, classic symptom of depressions. So that will help you to get a better idea when you talk to your psychiatrist and say, yeah, this sounded like classic early morning awakening to me. Okay, last thing, this is only the third one we're going to take a look at as far as actual techniques, empathic statements. Now, I don't think you'd be in this job if you were a pretty empathic person and you enjoyed working and talking with people. But empathic statements, we all have an idea of what they mean. We use them all the time with our friends, etc. But I just want to review it just a little bit. An empathic statement is any time that you or I is actually trying to communicate to another person, you know what, I have some sense or understanding of your pain or your thoughts or the experience or the stress you're going through. And you're trying to communicate that to the person, that this is something that you understand. I just want to show you, they often begin with words like, it sounds like. It sounds like you're having a really rough time at work with that boss. It looks like he's really hounding you. Okay? So let's take a look at a couple classic empathic statements on our slide. It sounds like it's a lonely place to be. Another empathic statement, it's a lonely place to be. And the final one, it looks like you're feeling very sad right now. all very nice examples of empathic statements. You're going to use a lot of empathic statements in this interview. You know, the course of a 30-minute interview, for instance, you might use anywhere between 5 or 10 of these, who knows how many. And they will arise naturally for you because as you understand the person's pain, it's natural to say, man, it sounds like you're going through a tough time, Jim. Or I'm sorry to hear that. You know, maybe the person said that they had a brother who died by a suicide. It's a classic place to say, well, I'm really sorry to hear that. Now, I want to show you something rather intriguing. Remember, I told you that in this course, we're trying to help you to be sophisticated and an informed interviewer. I'm going to show you something that a lot of clinicians don't even understand about empathic statements. Let's look at the first two on this slide again. The first one says, it sounds like it's a lonely place to be. Notice that the second one sounds just like it, only it says, it's a lonely place to be. The difference between those two, even though the last part of it is identical, is that in the first one, it sounds like it's a lonely place to be. You're not indicating that you're sure of it. Whereas the second one, it's a lonely place to be, you're indicating that you are sure that this is a lonely place to be. Well, we call that a difference in the valence of the empathy. And there's different sort of types of valence. The one we're interested in is when I tell you that I have a feeling of what's going on, am I indicating to you that I know it for a fact, or am I indicating that I think I get this? It's important to understand valence, and this might actually be of use to you maybe one time in the next year of you're taking calls on here. But imagine this for a minute. Imagine if the caller on the other line, or the other end of your line, is actually a person who is developing paranoid process. Maybe they're developing some form of schizophrenia. Well, as you try to be empathic with that person, if with a person who has paranoid process, you tell them you know what's going on in their mind, and you say something like, you know, it's a lonely place to be. You know what? They don't like that. Because the last thing a person with active paranoid process wants is somebody who is inside my head. So that tends to backfire. The simpler one, it sounds like it's a lonely place to be, which doesn't say that I know what you're experiencing. That one is more likely to work with a paranoid patient. By the way, if you actually spot the person is paranoid, generally speaking, they often don't want any empathic statements. So here's a little nugget that you've learned about clinical interviewing, or interviewing whether it's clinical or you're just doing a basic intake and gathering information for a clinician like you are. If you use one of these statements that has a high valence to it of certainty, it's a lonely place to be, and it backfires. By the way it backfires is the patient or client will say something like this to you. They go, I didn't say it's a lonely place to be, I said it's a tough place to be. So in other words, if they sort of confront you on what you've just said, it's indicating the empathic statement didn't take. The tip, that might be your first hint that the caller is actively paranoid. Now you're going to backtrack, use many less empathic statements, perhaps none at all, and it also highlights to you, boy, when I get to the segment on this, on psychotic process, I'm really going to hunt a little bit more deeply. So hopefully what you're starting to see is that we really can learn some pretty sophisticated interviewing tools that even though our interview is completely scheduled out for the most part, every once in a while they might be useful for us. But the other thing is I think you will feel more competent and more able to actually help the people who are calling into you. You know, that's it for the techniques. That's the ones we're going to utilize in our next module. We're going to switch and we're going to look at a few of these techniques, add a couple more, and what we're going to see is we're going to build an interviewing strategy that is going to be spelled out for you in the actual interview that you're doing for uncovering suicidal ideation, behavior, and planning and intent. I think you're going to find it's an easy technique to use or strategy, and you know what? I think there's a really good chance that at some point, if you stick with this job, you're going to save somebody's life by using these tools. See you next time. Thanks.